The hum of the scanner echoed through the sterile, chrome-lined hallway. Lena's fingers tapped nervously against the side of her thigh as she stood in line, waiting for her turn. The airport was a marvel of alien technology, a sleek hub where the traffic of countless species merged into a blur of intergalactic travelers. Despite the grandness of it all, Lena felt out of place. The metallic scent of the air mingled with the faint sound of hurried footsteps and the low buzz of communication devices. The air was cool, artificial, but she couldn't shake the sense that something about this moment felt wrong. Ahead of her, an alien officer stepped into the scanner, and the security system whirred to life. A mechanical voice announced, "Scan in progress." Lena's stomach twisted. She glanced around, her eyes darting to the different species passing through: tall, lithe Zorathians, squat, barrel-chested Borgians, and sleek-skinned Durillians. None of them seemed to give this process a second thought. But Lena wasn't just another traveler. She was human, one of the few remaining Earth-born citizens in the galaxy, and being a human meant a certain level of scrutiny. Her turn came. The officer waved her forward with a clipped gesture, the sharp lines of his uniform reflecting the cold, efficient nature of the station. He wasn't like the others. This one had a posture that was too rigid, his movements too precise, almost mechanical. His name tag read Raxus. She stepped into the scanner, her heart quickening as she watched the holographic images of her body materialize on the screen above. She stood still, feeling exposed under the unblinking eyes of the machine. For the briefest moment, Lena caught Raxus' gaze. His eyes were a striking amber, like molten metal, burning with an intensity she couldn't place. A soft beep interrupted her thoughts. The screen flickered. "Error detected," the machine announced in a calm, almost disinterested tone. Lena froze. "What do you mean, error?" The officer's expression remained neutral, but his lips thinned, as if fighting the urge to show something. He glanced at the screen again, and then at Lena. "Please step out of the scanner, human. It seems there is an issue." Lena's breath caught. She didn't like the way he said human. As if it was an infection on the otherwise pristine world of this station. The word held no empathy, only the cold weight of indifference. "What kind of issue?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though her nerves were rapidly fraying. "Protocol requires further examination," Raxus replied. His voice was smooth, clinical. Almost apologetic. Almost. Lena stepped out, her mind racing. She instinctively hugged her arms to her body, trying to maintain some semblance of control. Without warning, the officer moved toward her. "Please follow me." Her pulse spiked. She wasn't about to be dragged into some backroom, not after what she'd seen happen to other humans before. The stories of mistreatment, of the quiet hostility that lingered just below the surface in this galaxy. She wasn't here to become a part of some alien's curiosity. She opened her mouth to protest, but before she could say anything, Raxus spoke again. "It's standard procedure. Your body scan triggered a safety alarm. Nothing to worry about." The words were meant to reassure her, but the way his eyes flickered across her made her skin prickle. He wasn't worried. She could see that. "I'm just here to follow orders," he added, his gaze flicking toward a door at the end of the hall. Lena hesitated. There was a tight knot of something dark forming in her chest, but she forced herself to nod. She wasn't going to make a scene. Not yet. Raxus led her through a narrow corridor, where the stark white walls seemed to close in on her. The air felt thicker here, and the silence was unnerving. She caught sight of her own reflection in the smooth surface of the walls, her dark hair pulled back into a tight bun, her plain navy uniform that had once made her feel confident now seemed so human. So small in the face of this place. She felt her pulse quicken, her stomach twisting. "Your name is Lena," Raxus said, breaking the silence. "That's correct," she said, keeping her voice even. Raxus didn't respond right away. Instead, his amber eyes lingered on her, studying her. His gaze was heavy, filled with something she couldn't quite define. She could feel the weight of it pressing into her, making her uncomfortable. But there was something more to it, too, something she couldn't quite place. Beneath the cold, almost lifeless surface, there was an intensity that burned. "You've been traveling alone?" he asked, his voice softer now, less mechanical. Lena shot him a glance. "Why do you care?" Raxus paused, just a fraction of a second too long. Then he gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "I don't. Just trying to make conversation." She didn't believe him, but said nothing. They reached the door at the end of the hall. It slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a small, dimly lit room. A chair sat in the center, facing a massive glass panel that overlooked the bustling spaceport. Lena didn't sit, though. She kept her back straight, eyeing Raxus carefully. "Please sit down," Raxus said, his tone softer yet commanding. He stepped toward the console on the far wall and activated a series of buttons. She ignored his request. "What's really going on here?" Raxus didn't answer right away. The silence between them grew thick, heavy. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he turned back to her, his eyes piercing. "There's something about you, Lena," he said quietly. "Something I don't understand." Before she could reply, the door slammed shut behind her with an ominous hiss, trapping them both in the small room. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. And in that moment, Lena realized something. Raxus wasn't just an officer. He wasn't just a cold, calculating alien. There was something else behind his eyes. Something dangerous. The room felt smaller now. Lena knew this was only the beginning. Lena stood rigid, the hum of the cooling systems in the hallway a harsh backdrop to the silence between them. The corridor was narrow, lined with clean white panels that reflected the faint glow of overhead lights. The air smelled faintly of ozone, tinged with the cool metallic scent of the station's infrastructure. It was the sort of cold that numbed the senses, making her feel small, distant, almost unreal. Raxus had not spoken since they entered the corridor, his presence towering and silent beside her. She could feel his eyes on her, burning, watching. The way his gaze lingered just a little too long, the subtle tension in his posture as if waiting for something. It was like he was trying to unravel her, piece by piece, without her permission. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to remain calm. This was a routine scan. Nothing more. She could handle it. But even as she told herself that, a gnawing feeling of unease settled deep in her chest. There was more to this than a routine procedure. She could feel it. And the way Raxus had asked if she was traveling alone only added to the suspicion blooming in her mind. "You're human," he finally spoke, his voice low, careful, as if testing the words before letting them slip out. Lena kept her face neutral, despite the weight of the statement. "I am," she replied evenly, but she couldn't help the flicker of frustration that crossed her mind. As if being human was some sort of crime here. "How do you do it?" His question was softer, more intimate than she expected. "Do what?" she asked, surprised by the raw curiosity that lined his voice. "Survive," he said simply, his amber eyes fixing on hers. "To thrive, even in places like this. Among so many who view you as less." His words hung in the air, stark and pointed. It was as if he was speaking from his own experience. A deep, hidden resentment crept beneath the surface of his tone, but it was so subtle, she almost missed it. Lena didn't immediately respond. She wasn't sure how to. The truth was, the weight of humanity's place in the galaxy had always been a burden she had carried with little choice. Being one of the few humans left to explore the stars had its perks, but it was always overshadowed by the suspicion, the quiet condescension that lingered in the air. The constant feeling that her kind was an afterthought, an experiment in survival rather than a thriving species. "We just keep moving," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. Raxus' gaze softened, though just slightly. "And does that make you feel proud?" The question startled her. "Proud?" she repeated, shaking her head. "I don't think I've ever felt proud to be human. Not in the way you think." Her words seemed to hang between them, both a confession and a challenge. The silence deepened, and for a moment, it was as if the world around them had fallen away, just her and this enigmatic alien. Her stomach tightened. This wasn't just a routine scan. There was something more here, something she couldn't yet name. Raxus stepped closer, his presence overpowering in the small, sterile space. His scent was faint, a sharp, spicy tang that reminded her of an unknown forest. His form towered above her, his uniform sharp, the edges glinting under the fluorescent lights. He had the air of someone who was always in control, except now, there was something different in the way he stood, something uncertain. "You're lying," he said suddenly, his voice tight. Lena's breath hitched. "What?" "Your skin didn't trigger an error," he continued, his eyes flicking to her face and then quickly away. "It wasn't a mistake." A chill ran down her spine. "What are you talking about?" He paused, and for the first time, Lena saw something close to guilt flicker across his face. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but it left a strange ripple in the air. "I was told to bring you in for further questioning," he said, his voice low, almost regretful. "But the truth is, I didn't want to. I still don't. But it's not just the human race that interests the higher-ups, Lena." The way he said her name sent a tremor through her. She hadn't realized how much she had been avoiding his gaze, but now, under the weight of his words, she met it head-on. There was something in his eyes, a storm, swirling beneath the surface. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Raxus hesitated again, looking away, as though he was debating whether to reveal more. The seconds stretched, each one drawing them closer to something neither of them could ignore. Then, with a sigh, he spoke, his voice barely audible. "They want you, Lena. Not just your kind. You. There's something about you, something unique. They knew this, but they didn't know how to contain it." Lena felt a cold rush of panic settle into her stomach. She stepped back instinctively, her breath quickening. "Contain what?" Her mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of his words. She had always known that humanity's place in the galaxy was precarious, but this felt different. The stakes were higher than she had imagined. "I don't know," Raxus admitted, his voice soft, almost apologetic. "But I think they're watching us both now. Not just you. Me too." Lena's heart skipped. There it was again, the unsaid thing that had been hanging between them. They knew. And now, so did she. But what did this mean for her, and for Raxus? He wasn't just some cold, detached security officer. There was something far more complex beneath the surface. She could feel it. "I can't stay here," she said, the words a breathless rush as her mind scrambled to make sense of the situation. "I need to leave." Raxus didn't stop her when she moved to the door. But his voice, low, steady, followed her. "You can't. Not yet. They're already coming for you." Lena's blood ran cold. The door slid open, revealing a dimly lit hallway beyond. But it wasn't the hall that stopped her, it was the sense of inevitability, the weight of Raxus' words hanging in the air. "They're coming," he repeated, and this time, she could hear the faint tremor in his voice. And she realized in that moment that her world was about to change forever. Lena's pulse quickened, the air in the narrow hall suddenly feeling thick, as if the very walls had closed in around them. She took a step back, trying to regain her bearings. The pale light overhead flickered briefly, casting sharp shadows that twisted unnervingly across the hallway. Her eyes locked with Raxus once more, and she realized he wasn't just toying with her. The hesitation in his gaze wasn't feigned, and neither was the weight of his words. "You're telling me it wasn't a mistake?" she asked, her voice low but edged with a tremor she couldn't hide. Her heart pounded harder in her chest as the pieces began to click together in her mind. Something deeper, something far more dangerous than a simple security scan was at play here. Raxus' amber eyes burned with an intensity she had only seen in the stories of humans who'd survived the most hellish conditions. There was conflict in him, she could sense it, but there was also something far more dangerous. Something that suggested he was trapped in a world where his choices didn't belong to him. "No," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It wasn't an error. I was sent to bring you in. To question you. He hesitated again, his jaw tightening. But the truth is, I don't know why. Lena felt a cold shiver crawl down her spine. She'd known from the moment she set foot on the station that being human meant being under constant surveillance. That was a given. But this felt different. Too different. She folded her arms, trying to hold on to her composure, though the uncertainty gnawed at her. Then why not just do it? She demanded, her voice sharp. What's stopping you? If it's part of the protocol, what's the hold-up? Just take me in. Raxus took a step closer. The air between them seemed to pulse, thick with unspoken tension. His presence was imposing, like a force she couldn't easily ignore. Despite his alien form, his height and the smooth, angular lines of his uniform, Lena felt an undeniable magnetism that she couldn't explain. There was something in his gaze, the flicker of something raw, human even, that seemed to draw her in against her will. Because I'm not supposed to be doing this, he said, his voice barely audible, as though the confession itself was a betrayal. His eyes darted briefly to the door at the end of the hall, as if expecting someone to be standing there, listening. When he looked back at her, there was a vulnerability in him that didn't belong in this sterile, cold place. Lena felt a surge of confusion rise in her chest, her thoughts colliding like 1,000 pieces of jagged glass. She wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to be talking to her like this. She didn't know what to believe anymore, didn't know if the person standing before her was an ally or another agent of the system that had kept humanity in its place for centuries. You're not supposed to be doing what? She pressed, her voice rising despite her better judgment. She could feel her control slipping, but something in Raxus made her want answers, something beyond the cold, robotic figure he'd first appeared to be. What is this, Raxus? What is really going on here? His face tightened, his lips pressing into a thin line. For a moment, it felt as though he might shut her out again, that same indifference returning. But then he spoke, his words raw and unpolished, laced with something like regret. They want to test you, he muttered, his eyes darkening as the weight of the truth seemed to settle between them. The higher-ups, they think you know something. Something about Earth. About humans. And they want to see how far you'll go to protect it. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She had heard rumors, whispers in the darkest corners of the galaxy. Of human DNA being coveted, of secretive experiments and manipulations. But to hear it spoken out loud, to feel the truth settle like a stone in her stomach, it hit her harder than she'd expected. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but she also knew better than to show weakness. Not here. Not now. Raxus' lips curled into something like a bitter smile, though his eyes remained pained. I don't think you do. But I think you're about to find out. The words lingered in the air, thick with implications. A silence settled between them once more, but this time it was different. It wasn't just the oppressive weight of their surroundings. It was something deeper, something that tied them together in a way Lena couldn't yet comprehend. Why me? She asked softly, her voice raw with the vulnerability she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. Why are you telling me this, Raxus? You could have just followed orders, done your job. Why warn me? He didn't answer right away. Instead, his gaze dropped to the floor, as though struggling with some internal battle. Lena wanted to reach out, to pull him from whatever it was he was fighting, but she didn't. She couldn't afford to. Not in this place, not with everything at stake. Finally, his voice broke the silence, heavy and thick. Because I'm starting to believe you might be the only one who can fix this. If you don't, they'll destroy everything. Lena felt her blood run cold. His words hit her like a physical blow, a weight crashing down on her shoulders. They'll destroy everything. The gravity of that statement sank deep into her bones. But it wasn't just his words that haunted her, it was the raw, almost desperate look in his eyes. He believed it. He believed in her. She opened her mouth to respond, but the sound of footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor. Raxus' head snapped toward the noise, his body tense. You need to leave. Now. Before Lena could protest, he was already moving, pulling her down another hallway, away from the direction of the footsteps. Her heart raced in her chest as she followed him, but she knew it was too late to turn back. The air crackled with a strange energy, and every step they took felt like a countdown to something inevitable. And somewhere deep in her chest, she knew this was only the beginning. They were running now, but toward what? The silence between Lena and Raxus stretched, thick and suffocating. The dull hum of the station's systems filled the void, the cold metallic walls reflecting the isolation that pressed down on them both. The world outside, vast and infinite, felt a galaxy away, while in this cramped hallway, everything seemed to orbit around the tension building in the space between them. Lena's breath came in shallow bursts. She had asked the question, "Why me?" and now, she was desperate for the answer. But Raxus didn't offer it immediately. Instead, he took a step closer, his shadow falling over her, his gaze burning through her with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. "I can't tell you everything," Raxus said, his voice gravelly, edged with a sense of finality. "Not yet. But what I can tell you is this: they want to test you. They believe that something about your DNA, something about humans, can unlock a power they've been trying to harness for centuries." The weight of his words slammed into her chest, and for a moment, she felt lightheaded. Her mind reeled with the implications. Power? DNA? Lena wasn't just some accidental test subject. She wasn't a casualty of some poorly thought-out experiment. She was chosen, targeted, manipulated. She struggled to maintain her composure. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice a blend of defiance and fear. Raxus' eyes flickered to the door at the end of the corridor, his jaw tightening. "I can't say. But they've been watching you, Lena. For a long time. And now they believe it's time to draw you out. To see what you're truly capable of." He paused, stepping closer, his breath warm against her cheek. "And I'm caught in the middle of it." Lena swallowed hard, the sensation of his proximity unsettling. Her pulse thudded in her ears, but she forced herself to speak, to dig deeper. "Caught in the middle? What do you mean?" "You're an agent. You could easily—" His fingers, long and firm, brushed lightly against her arm, halting her mid-sentence. "You think I'm an agent?" His tone was almost incredulous, the edge of bitterness unmistakable. "I'm not just an agent. I'm stuck, Lena. Stuck between what I'm supposed to do and what I know is right. What I know, you deserve to know." Lena felt a pang in her chest. There was truth in his voice, something raw and unfiltered. His struggle mirrored her own, the battle between survival and doing what was just. But unlike her, Raxus was tied to something larger. His choices weren't his own, and that realization made her stomach churn. He was playing a game with rules he didn't control, and now, she was a piece in that game. "What happens if I refuse?" Lena asked, her voice firm, though she wasn't sure she was ready for the answer. The thought of being used in some grand experiment was enough to make her skin crawl, but she wasn't going to bend to someone else's will. Not this time. Raxus's lips pressed together, his eyes flickering with something dangerous. "They'll come for you. And they'll come for me, too." Lena's mind raced. The gravity of this situation weighed on her like an iron chain, pulling her deeper into the unknown. She wanted to ask more, demand answers, but a noise from behind her cut through her thoughts. The soft thud of boots on metal. Footsteps. She turned swiftly, her heart skipping a beat, but there was no one there. Just a shadow, a faint movement that could have been a trick of the light. But in that moment she knew they weren't alone. Someone was watching them. Raxus's eyes widened, his hand shooting out to grab her wrist, pulling her toward him with a strength that made her breath catch. "We need to move. Now." Her heart raced as he guided her down the hallway, his grip firm yet not painful. She followed his lead, the urgency in his movements setting her on edge. She didn't know what was happening, but she could feel it, the shift, the growing threat. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice breathless as they navigated the maze of corridors. "I'm getting you out of here," he said simply. His voice was steady, but his jaw was clenched tight, a sign of the internal battle waging inside him. They'll be looking for us soon. And when they do, it won't just be me they'll be hunting. As they turned a corner, Lena's eyes flicked back to the hall they had just left. She could feel the prickle of unseen eyes, the sensation of being watched. She wasn't sure if it was paranoia or if Raxus was right. But one thing was certain, they couldn't stay in the open for much longer. The soft chime of an alarm rang through the station, slicing through the tension like a blade. Red lights flashed, casting everything in a garish, warning glow. The station was going on lockdown. The chase had begun. Shit, Raxus muttered under his breath, pulling her into a small alcove. The walls here were lined with sealed doors, storage units that appeared to be abandoned. He crouched low, his eyes scanning the hallway with an alertness that sent a chill down her spine. They're tracking us. We don't have much time. Lena pressed herself against the cool wall, trying to steady her breathing, though her heart felt like it was hammering out of her chest. She felt the weight of Raxus' presence beside her, intensely close, too close, but in this moment, it was the only thing that kept her grounded. He leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. You need to trust me. This is bigger than either of us. Lena turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his. For the first time, she saw the uncertainty in his expression, the vulnerability that mirrored her own. She didn't know what the next move was. She didn't know how they would escape. But in that moment she knew one thing, she didn't want to face it alone. With a sharp nod she whispered, I trust you. Raxus' lips curled into a fleeting, almost reluctant smile. Then hold on tight. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the corridor. The game had begun.